Okay, we shall, without much ado, start the last session before lunch. We have 4 presentations here, and it's a very interesting mix of presentations. The session is, of course, trade and development, and there's a strong trade focus. There are 2 papers, at least, which look directly at the impact of either trade or trade policy. One is the impact of energy trade on energy intensity and emissions, and there's also a paper on the impact of import bans, which is a particular type of trade policy, on agricultural production. And then we have 2 others. One looks at enterprise performance in special economic zones, industrial parks, EPZs, a subject which is close to my heart, and also the shipping costs incurred by firms. A very, very interesting set of presentations. Just one personal note, when I first came to the World Bank, it was in '89, about a year or so before I actually joined the bank. It was a presentation based on my PhD thesis, and the most common question at the end of my presentation was not so much on methodology, which is the main focus of questions here, but what are the policy implications of what you said? So in the World Bank, people are always concerned about the policy implications. So I may touch upon that later if I have time. So we have about 10-12 minutes for each presentation, followed by 5 minutes of questions and answers. And if we can stick to the time, I may have 2 or 3 minutes to say something at the end. So the first presentation is, as I said, there's one on the impact of energy trade on CO2 emissions, energy intensity in the context of South Asian nations. The presenter is Eshrat Hossain, who is a senior research associate at SANEM, but I think she's presenting on behalf of her colleague Eshrat Sharmin. I don't know if she's here in the room today, maybe not, who is also a senior research associate at SANEM.
Hello, everyone. I'm Israt Hossain, working as a senior research associate at SANEM. And this research work, I have done it with one of my colleagues, Eshrat Sharmin. I'm presenting on behalf of 2 of us. So the headline of our research work is, does energy trade impact energy intensity? So at first, I will give an introduction that why we are considering energy trade and energy intensity. For the last couple of years, we are facing a global energy crisis. And as Mr. Hans Timmer said, we need to focus on long run with the short run also. So we need a long run solution of our current energy crisis. For that, we need to focus on the energy mechanics, energy sector mechanics, which is very much dependent on the energy trade. So existing literature regarding energy trade commonly connect with economic benefits, GDP growth, energy security. Energy trade is basically, it is considered as a tool to increase the efficient use of primary energy all the world. But while energy trade solves the gap between energy resources reserve and energy consumption, it may affect the carbon dioxide as it works as an economic growth enhancing factor. Point to be noted here is we are actually mean fossil fuel trade by the energy trade. We are not considering the renewable energy here. So why we are connecting energy trade with energy intensity? First, I will introduce the concept. I hope all of you know about it. Energy intensity is defined as the ratio of energy used to gross domestic product, indicating how well the economy converts energy into monetary output. So like per unit of GDP, to produce per unit of GDP, how much primary energy we are using, energy intensity calculate that. So it is often used to assess the energy efficiency. Actually, energy intensity is a measure of energy inefficiency in the energy sector. So we have thought about whether there is any connection between energy trade and energy intensity. Eventually, some other energy variables have been added in the research. So about data and definition, we got the data of energy intensity from the International Energy Agency, and same for fossil fuel subsidy and the renewable energy consumption, which is the percentage of total final energy consumption. We got it from World Bank Open Data. And the import and export value of energy trade, I mean the fossil fuel trade, we got it from Chatham House. So come to the methodology. This study aims to test the connection between energy intensity with the energy trade. Also, how energy variables like renewable energy consumption, electricity production from renewable sources, or fossil fuel subsidy affect the energy intensity is another rationale. Our dataset consists of 148 countries and 20 years time period. So since it's a large panel data set, so we are following 3 steps of research here. First, we will have the panel unit root test, then the Pedroni co-integration technique, and the last one is estimation of the long-run coefficients of variables by applying the dynamic ordinary least square estimation. So come to the panel unit root test. There are so many unit root tests are there, and we have chosen 5 unit root tests, 5 standardized unit root tests. Like the first one is Levin et al., which is LLC Levin-Lin-Chu test. Then Bruting, then Im et al. So and the last 2 are augmented Dickey-Fuller Fisher chi-square test, and the last one is Fisher chi-square test. So the difference among the tests are the LLC test and the BRT test. We are assuming here a common unit root process across countries. And for the other 3 tests, we are assuming an individual unit root process across the cross sections. So our second methodology is the Pedroni co-integration technique. According to Peter Pedroni, 1999, he estimated 7 test statistics to test the null hypothesis of no co-integration in non-stationary panels. So the test statistics allow both long-run and short-run heterogeneous panels. All the test statistics are residual-based tests with residuals collected from a multivariate regression equation. Several series and parameters are calculated from the regression residuals, and 7 test statistics are calculated from the series and parameters. So the last one is panel dynamic ordinary least square. The extension of the individual time series dynamic ordinary least square is named as panel dynamic ordinary least square estimation. It is an efficient single equation estimate of the co-integrating vector. PDOALS estimators are used to get the coefficients of the analysis variable in the modeling of each panel. Here we have transformed all the analysis variables into natural logarithms, except the renewable energy consumption as it is in the percentage form in the dataset. So I will not explain the whole panel unit root test result. I will just give you the interpretations. So we have tested the 5 test statistics. And then we got the result that in case of assuming a common unit root process across countries, LLC test implies energy intensity and import don't have unit root as their statistics are significant, but renewable energy consumption and export have unit roots. The Bruting test implies energy intensity, renewable energy consumption, export have unit roots, but the imports does not have the unit root. In case of assuming an individual unit root process across the cross sections, the Pearson test implies that only renewable energy consumption has unit root. And the ADF Fisher chi-square test implies all have unit roots other than energy intensity. And the last PP Fisher chi-square test implies only renewable energy has unit roots. So we can see that we have a different kind of result. Some variables are some stochastic processes have unit root and some does not have, and the results vary because of the test statistics. So then we will come into the Pedroni co-integration test. So the 7 test statistics, 4 test statistics are in panel form and 3 test statistics are in group form. So for energy intensity with energy import and other variables, we have shown the results in different columns. So to interpret the results, the null hypothesis is that there is no co-integration between variables. For energy intensity and import, as well as energy intensity and export, that is the relationship between energy intensity and the trade, fossil fuel trade, all tests except panel V and ADF are statistically significant at a 5% level. In the case of energy intensity and renewable energy consumption, all tests are significant except the panel ADF and group ADF. The test results indicate that there is a co-integrating relationship between energy intensity and other variables. That means export, import, and renewable energy consumption, which implies the variables pair have long-run equilibrium. That means each pair, like energy intensity and export, energy intensity and import, and energy intensity and renewable energy consumption, each pair have long-run equilibrium relationship. Here, all the test statistics are residual-based tests. Common time dummies have been included to address simple cross-sectional dependence. So lastly, we will analyze the Pedroni's PDOLS, the panel dynamic ordinary least square. And here we have 2 boxes, like one is data has not been time diminished, and another is data has been time diminished. So when we are not time diminishing the data, both the table are showing a completely different result. When we are time diminishing the data, we are having a completely different direction of panel regression. So come to the interpretation part. Here the null hypothesis is that slope coefficient is equal to 1, and I'm not going to the specifications. I'm just interpreting the result. We can assume that here cross-sectional dependence prevails because the time diminishing data are the time diminishing results are completely different, and the results are showing significant relationship of energy intensity with energy export, import, and renewable energy consumption. Here the important part is the positive values of beta for energy export and import implies that energy trade will raise the energy intensity, which means energy inefficiency will rise if fossil fuel trade rises. And the next one is the negative value of beta for renewable energy consumption implies that it will decrease the energy intensity. That means renewable energy consumption, the more renewable energy consumption will be there, the less energy intensity will be there. So energy inefficiency will fall. So my study ends here. I have listed some limitations. Actually, I want to work on these limitations and to extend my study. Thank you all.
Thank you, Eshrat. Thanks a lot. We'll have about 4 minutes for questions and answers. And I see one question right at the back. Let's start with that.
Hi, my question is, would this study be a correlational study or a causal study? Because if it's causal, it sounds like the research question is correlational, but in the interpretation part, it sounds like by, let's say, increasing energy trade, that would lead to some sort of effect on energy intensity. But if it's causal, I think we would also need to consider the reverse causality, meaning if there is a change in energy intensity, whether that facilitates energy trade in any way. So I wanted to see whether you've explored that channel and what are some of the empirical results that you've generated, if any. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, you are talking about the second part of my plan. Actually, the first part of my plan was to explore whether there is any correlation between energy intensity and energy trade, and then I will check if they have any causal relationship. Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, I can still give you 1 minute if you had something important to say which you could not.
Yeah, I could not speak about the limitations or the future plans of my study, and because I have a plan to run a multivariate panel dynamic ordinary least square estimation. I guess that could be more intuitive. And about the other variables, the renewable energy production and fossil fuel subsidy, the available data actually are more contracted time periods, because we have 15 years time periods and 10 years time periods for renewable energy production and fossil fuel subsidy. So I guess the fixed effect estimator or the common correlated effects estimator could be used in the case of these two variables, and this is my future plan for this study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eshrat, and please pass on our thanks to the other Eshrat, your co-author. We wish he was here, but very good work. So trade cannot happen without, well, in most cases, without shipment. And that brings us to the next paper, where Deluair Hossen will tell us about his research based on firm-level evidence from Bangladesh on shipment costs and shipping frequency. Dr. Hossain is a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville.
You can use that.
Thank you, everyone, for giving me this opportunity to presenting my paper on financing cost, per shipment cost, and shipping frequency, farm-level evidence from Bangladesh. So the recent literature shows that time is a big trade barrier, because the tariff and other things are coming down, not recently, but across the years, time has become a big trade barrier now. And we see that in international trade, ordering, producing, and shipping products takes significant time, especially for developing country. And this creates two challenges. So the firms who are engaged in trade, they have to procure their amount, and they will do that for cost minimization by choosing an optimal order size and shipping frequency. But for producer in developing country, because of this time lag, they also have to acquire working capital, which is costly because of this time lag. And both of these challenges are discussed in two disconnected literature. So the shipping frequency literature, this is focusing on the trade-off between per shipment fixed cost and variable inventory storage cost. So there is this fixed cost and this variable cost. So the trade-up is happening for the shipping frequency literacy. And for the financial constant literature, this is focusing, on the other hand, on the interest rate cost, the nature of financial contract between exporter and importer, and the farm heterogeneity. So my goal is to combine these two disconnected issues in a single model and try to empirically test the model outcomes. So this is a very simple model where exporter receive order size of X, and it has a marginal cost C, and after producing, it pays delivery fees F. So exporter is located in a developing country, financially constrained, so it has to hire labor inputs by borrowing this working capital at the rate of exponential delta R. Delta is the delivery time, or in supply chain literature, the lead time, and R is the exporter country rate. So exporter will accept importer's offer of supplying order X if it cost met W is greater than XC E delta R, so the production cost plus the delivery fee. But usually in this case, importers have all the bargaining power, and it is minimizing its procurement cost, so they will only pay the equal amount of that. And now the present value will be E minus delta RW. So R1 is the importer's interest rate. So there is this two interest rate. One is the exporter country interest rate, and another one is the importer country exporter rate. So cost for a single order will be E minus delta R1 and then the order size amount. So in this model, the importer is procuring Q amount of products for a time here standardized to 1. And these orders, there is this assumption of same size and similarly spaced. So it is coming from the supply chain literature that usually trade is lumpy, and they are doing this kind of same size order for similarly spaced time. So from this, our order frequency N will be Q by X, because Q is the total procurement amount. And then we have in between order time. So there is this two time, one lead time, delta, and another is X by Q. So this is for one time period. Now, if we take all the present value of this, all the shipments, it will be that amount. So our task is to minimize that amount. And if we do solve the problem, we get this two proposition. So there, for X greater than 0, there exists this unique shipping size X that depends on several factors. So exporter and importer interest rate, delivery time, per shipment cost, and procurement quantity, and it minimize the farm's procurement cost. And the second proposition is about the financing cost interaction and the delivery time and per shipment fixed cost. So only the 4 per shipment fixed cost effect on the shipping frequency, that is already in the literature, and it's in line with that literature. Other things we can empirically test those things, but here our variable of interest is shipping frequency. So this is a margin now exporter or importer can use in a trade situation. So in this empirical study, I merged farm level export data from Bangladesh from 2006 to 2013, and then I used destination level per shipment fixed cost from World Bank, and then financing cost data from IMF. So when I do this, I try to overcome several biases existing in the literature. So I do aggregation bias, I solved this by doing all this farm level, product level, and country level analysis. And I also overcome heteroscedasticity bias by considering Poisson pseudo maximum likelihood PPML model with a high dimensional fixed effect. And I also use overcome omitted variable bias by including this kind of financing cost and narrow fixed effect sometimes even at the farm level. So the initial findings is there is this omitted variable bias in the existing literature, and we see the financing cost increases the shipping frequency, so that margin of trade is very visible. And overall, a 10% higher per shipment cost reduces shipping frequency by 3.24%. So this is the variable I'm using. There are several kind of variables. So this is the first few is export from trade data, Bangladesh custom data, and then I have distance and time from several sources. So doing business survey database, it's now legacy. World Bank discontinued it because of some problem. I also use some gravity variables, control variables, mostly from CEPI gravity dataset and CEPI distance dataset. And for the financing cost, I use exporter and importer interest rate, net interest margin, and some of the other debt-equity ratio. Some of these from Beck and Demir-Kuhn paper, and others are from IMF. I also use the logistic performance index from LPI database of World Bank. So this is my specification. It seems a little bit larger than here. So there is this different spline, because for distance, Bangladesh data is a little bit interesting, because all of our expert is happening either in Europe or in USA. So I had to use distant spline to accommodate those facts. And I have that FJT, that is the per shipment fixed cost variable, and then I have RT and RJT, this is exporter and importer country financing cost. So here it's the interest rate. And then I have some control variables, gravity variables. I have others fixed effect, because I used high dimensional fixed effect. So I have country and then product, not country, sorry, the product, the transport mode, farm, and time fixed effect. So when I use all those fixed effect, let me present the result from in column 1, where I didn't use any of those. It just OLS analysis, and I see there is this match with the GDP and other things from the literature. It's a positive effect on shipping frequency, but for per shipment fixed cost, it's negative. It's also matching with the literature, but it's not significant. For that, I have to use PPLM and some other fixed effects. So you can see later, column 2 to 4, I do country level analysis with ER fixed effect, and the cluster standard clusters are country level. For product, I use product, so SS8 code, product code, transport mode, and ER fixed effect. So these are so by product, by mode, by ER fixed effect. And for exporter level, I did also that kind of fixed effect. And you see across all the column, I have this negative consistent result of higher per shipment fixed cost and negative shipping frequency. So that means when you have this higher per shipment cost, firms are choosing less shipment, so big order. That means more working capital, borrowing them, which is very costly. So these are for Bangladesh analysis, right? And then I also include all those to deal with the omitted variable bias, all those financing cost, the interaction of that. And I see the per shipment fixed cost effects is increasing. So in column 4, I can see it's minus, the elasticity is 0.335, which is way larger from the literature. And the interaction time, you can see importer and exporter interest rate is 0.006. It's a very small interaction term comparing to the data, but it is still very significant. I also do bunch of other analyses robustness or transport mode based, so air, ocean, and land. Everywhere I see this consistent result of negative effect on per shipment fixed cost. And let me remind you, in Bangladesh, those kind of per shipment fixed cost is very high compared to developed countries. And also in Bangladesh, interest rate is also high. So working capital borrowing is very difficult. So if I have this conclusion for Bangladesh, the policy aspect will be very important, because if we can somehow manage this per shipment fixed cost in custom and other area lower, then the financing demand will be low also, because you can make very many small shipment and you don't need that much working capital. So you can facilitate the farm in that way. So that's the policy impact. And from the theoretical model, the first three bullet point is from theoretical model. We see, yes, there is this lead time based impact on shipping frequency. And from the estimation, we can see for Bangladesh, it's important than other developed country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deluair Hossen. That was a very interesting presentation, and thanks also for drawing out some policy implications towards the end. So let me open up the floor. We have about 4 to 5 minutes. So we have a question right here in the front.
So in Bangladesh, maybe I missed it, in the export and importing countries, but many of the export in Bangladesh, the raw materials are imported too. So does that change your estimation at all?
Yeah, so in the estimation, that's why I used many narrow fixed effect, so that the demand side and the marginal cost sides are kind of taken care of with this high dimensional fixed effect. So it's even there is a farm level fixed effect. So even if farm is across the year choosing different kind of raw materials and there is any change of that, that will be absorbed by the fixed effect to show only the effect of financing cost or per shipment fixed cost on the shipping frequency.
Yes? Did you want to ask a question? No. No, I just saw a slight movement of your hand. Salim, any questions from the online?
No question from chat box here.
Okay, so good. So I think Dr. Devaki Ghose is lucky. There will be a bit more time. And also for the next presenter. So, so I'll invite Dr. Devaki Ghose to get ready for the presentation. And while she does that, I just want to mention, as all of you know, policy making always involves some trade-offs. And there are trade-offs in the short run, and there are things that happen in the long run. And ideally, you'd like the policymakers to have done enough analysis to think about those trade-offs. But often that doesn't happen at ex post. You come to know about the divergence between the intended impact of a policy and some of the unintended consequences. And this next presentation is a good illustration of that. Now, some of us know that about 2 years ago in April 2021, suddenly the Sri Lankan government imposed a ban on imports of chemical fertilizers. And the objective was very noble, to promote sustainable agriculture. But as I was saying, the impact often goes beyond what your original objective is. So we're going to learn about that. Dr. Devaki Ghose, who is in the Trade and International Integration Unit of the World Bank. And I believe this is a joint work with your colleague, Fraga Fernandes.
Yeah, this is so I'm going to be talking about fertilizer import ban, agro-exports, and welfare evidence from Sri Lanka. This is joint work with Eduardo Fraga, Ana Fernandes, Gonzalo Varela, all of whom are in the World Bank. Thank you. Well, so basically, in April 2021, the Sri Lankan government instituted a sudden ban on most chemical fertilizers with the intention of becoming the first fully organic country. Now, as you know, most of agriculture, in fact, uses chemical fertilizer, and Sri Lanka imports almost all of its fertilizers, which means that agriculture production plummeted. There were farmer protests, and 6 months later, Sri Lankan government rolled back the ban on chemical fertilizer. But by then, yields may have already declined because there is a very specific window during which fertilizer can be applied to crops in order to be effective. across national and international media, there was widespread concern that this policy has basically plunged Sri Lanka's economy into a deep crisis. The question we're going to be asking today is, what are the aggregate and distributional consequences of a sudden shift in agricultural policy on production, trade, and welfare? And as you see, this is a very, very recent policy. So the work I'm going to be showing you is very much work in progress. In fact, this is the first time I'm presenting it. So of course, any feedback is greatly welcome. So I'm going to talk about all of this today, production and trade, but not welfare. So why is this relevant? So import ban on fertilizer in Sri Lanka is relevant as the country is highly dependent on imported chemical fertilizers, but there's basically almost no domestic supply of chemical fertilizer. This question is also very much relevant for spatial inequality, as the extent of the effects depends on the regional distribution of fertilizer-intensive crops. So some regions have comparative advantage in growing certain types of crops, which differ in how much fertilizer they require. Therefore, a shock to fertilizer availability will translate into regional inequality depending on the comparative advantages of the regions in different types of fertilizer-intensive crops. So that's the basic idea of why this ban can affect regional inequality. And this is a very relevant question, as you can see that there is a war with the Russia-Ukraine war. There's a global shortage of fertilizer. So the evidence from this study can also be applied to understand how the global fertilizer shortage can indeed affect certain countries. Very briefly, I contribute to two main strands of literature. The first is a literature on the quantitative spatial models with focus on agriculture. And in this literature, mainly what we're doing is we're adding this fertilizer intensity across crops in the firm's production function. And if you combine this fact that there are different regional advantages in crops, this fertilizer shock has the potential to generate regional inequality. The second literature we are contributing to is the literature on non-tariff measures, specifically import prohibitions. So here we are looking at the impact of an import ban on a very crucial intermediate input, which is fertilizers, on trade flows at both product and firm levels, also on domestic outcomes such as agriculture production, where we are using advanced remote sensing methods to get current 2022, as we speak, agricultural yield data. And also we look at the impact on household welfare using a general equilibrium model, which is not going to be part of today's presentation, the last part, welfare. So for this, we digitized Sri Lanka's extraordinary gadgets on imports and exports from March 2020 to October 2022 to identify the HS8 products that were subject to an import ban. At the same time, we access transaction level daily Sri Lankan import-export data at the firm-to-firm level between January 2017 to October 2002. We have daily information on value, weight, and quantity at HSA domestic firm foreign partner level. We get chemical fertilizer requirements per hectare across many different types of crops from Sri Lanka's National Fertilizer Secretariat. In addition, we use state-of-the-art remote sensing methods to actually predict yield at a granular plot level. And we compare this with actual yield information from Sri Lanka's Department of Census and Statistics, which are available at a more aggregated level district. So to understand, the first question, of course, is, was the ban effective? So to do that, we first show you the effect of this fertilizer import ban on the import of fertilizer into the country. So to do this, we use the Chesmate and they Fue event study design to account for the fact that this ban could have switched on and off. So we are doing a difference in difference, except that it's quite state of the art in that it allows for the ban to turn on and off, which is what happened in the country. So what we're doing is we're comparing the imports of fertilizer into the country at a monthly level before and after the ban. So beta tau is basically the year-by-year event study coefficient of the impact of the ban on log imports. And we also look at the impact of the ban on the extensive margin. And the first thing we show you is the effect of the ban on imports at the extensive margin. Here we see that right after the ban was implemented, that's in periods, that's period 0 is denoted by when the ban was implemented, there was a large decline in fertilizer imports. So it's decline of about 68% relative to the baseline probability. Now, at the same time, if you look at the intensive margin, right after the ban was instituted, there was a drop in fertilizer imports into the country, but the largest drop occurs a few months later, 4 months later, which was about a more than 90% decline in fertilizer imports into the country, which basically means that there was almost no fertilizer coming in. Now, at the same time that you see that this fertilizer import ban and this huge decline in fertilizer imports are happening in the country, there was an unprecedented decline in rice production in the country, unprecedented in that it did not happen in the last 10 years. So if you look at rice production in Sri Lanka, we are looking at the yield of Maha rice. So Maha rice is the main growing season in Sri Lanka. And it's right before the Maha sowing season that this fertilizer ban was implemented. And what you see is that a more than 75% decline in rice production in Sri Lanka if you compare to any pre-period year in the last 10 years. Now, at the same time, you see this decline in production. You see a huge increase in rice imports into the country. From a level of virtually zero rice imports, Sri Lankan rice imports became about $40 million in January 2022, which is about a more than 100,000% increase. Now, we see that there was a decline in fertilizers imports into the country. We also see a decline in production. For now, we only have the results for rice. Other crops are in the making. What happened to exports? That's the question. Okay, sorry, before going to exports, let me show you actually the fact that there was regional heterogeneity in this rice yield decline, right? So on the left-hand side, we plot the Maha rice yields across Sri Lankan regions. The green ones represent higher values and the red ones represent lower values. And this is in kg per hectare. This is 2020 to 2021, the Maha season mark, which is September 2020 to March 2021, right before the ban in April 2021. Now we show you the same plot, but for the next Maha production season. And you see that there is a precipitous decline in all the parts of the country, but more so in the north and the central region than in other parts of Sri Lanka. So there was indeed a big regional heterogeneity in how much rice production declined. Now we come to what I was talking about before, which is export. We see that there's a decline in rice production. We see that there's a decline in fertilizer imports coming into the country. What happens to agricultural exports? Now, to understand what happens to agricultural exports, we're going to be using the fact that different types of crops require different types of fertilizers per unit. For example, soybeans require the most amount of metric ton of fertilizer per hectare compared to most other crops like onions. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be first in our product level event study, we're going to be comparing the exports of crops that require more fertilizer inputs in its production compared to the exports of crops that do not require much fertilizer. And we use the 75th percentile as the cutoff to define the treatment group and the control group. And then in our second type of event study, we do a firm level event study where we are going to be comparing the exports of firms, agricultural exports of firms who are exporting more fertilizer intensive products compared to the agricultural exports of firms who are exporting less fertilizer intensive products. So to do that, of course, we have to go from product level to firm level. We're leaving, I'm going to leave the technical details out of this, but the main idea is that we look at the different types of products and their different fertilizer intensity, as I showed you in the graph before. Then we look at what was the firm exporting before the ban was instituted. So we use those firms' pre-ban exports as the weights, and therefore we are able to construct a measure of firm level, the firm's exposure to the fertilizer ban, so to say. And then we again use the same cutoff, 75th percentile, to define treatment and control firm. And we look at what happened to firm level exports of firms who are exposed to the more fertilizer ban compared to firms who were exposed less to the fertilizer ban. So first, I show you the results of our product level event study. So here you can see that right after, so this is very important that here we are showing the results of the event study using quarters, not months, because you might imagine that it takes some time for the effect on import ban to show up on exports. So we're looking at quarter. And here you can see that after the ban on fertilizer imports, there was a decline of agriculture exports in the first 3 quarters in the data. And this decline was about 88% around those 3-4 quarters. Now, if we look at the effect of the ban on exports at the firm level, we see a very similar picture that right after the ban was instituted in period 0, there was a sharp decline in agriculture exports, and it stays like that for about 3 quarters, and this decline was about 28%. Now, you see that the largest declines here, for example, for product, happens 3 quarters later. For firms also, you see it happens 3 quarters later, and because any effect on exports takes time to materialize. Fertilizer is just an input. It goes into production. From those productions, some things will be exported. So that explains some of the delayed effects. So this is something we don't show you today, but what we have basically done is that we want to understand how this ban affected the whole Sri Lankan economy. We have shown you what happened to production. We have shown you what happened to trade, but we want to understand the welfare implications of this in the country. So to do this, we are building a quantitative spatial model of agriculture, production, and trade, where there are many different regions within Sri Lanka and one rest of the world. There is 3 sectors. So one is an agriculture sector, manufacturing sector, and fertilizer, where fertilizer is an exclusive importable intermediate input in agriculture to reflect the reality in Sri Lanka. In the model, the crops differ in fertilizer intensity and regions differ in the types of crops they are producing. And this is how a shock to fertilizer availability affects different regions and different groups of people differently, because they all differ in the types of crops they produce, which in turn differ in how much fertilizer intensive they are. So right now we're in the process of estimating the model parameters. We do a simulation where we increase the transport cost in the model to match the fall in imports and to understand the economic-wide welfare impacts. Yeah, so that's what we have today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very fascinating study, and I'm sure something with tremendous policy implications, but also, as I was mentioning at the beginning, it also tells us a bit about how the failure to understand trade-offs in time may have a serious adverse impact on outcomes. So let's open up. Mugdha, please go ahead, and then we'll come to you.
Devaki, as usual, fascinating work, fascinating presentation. Thank you. So a few questions. So first of all, such a, for economists, such a good policy to analyze, but the timing. So because the world was deep into COVID at that time, so I wonder, because I didn't see anything that could have a differential effect of COVID. Number one, because let's say COVID was having an impact generally on the country, and if there were some regional differences, whether it has an impact on your outcome. Second is that, again, Sri Lanka, interesting case, because we saw the political outcome recently. Do you think that this import ban, or can you relate to any of the regional political outcome in terms of resurgence or anything, has something to do with this policy? And third, I think it would be really interesting to see the year-to-year comparison. I know why you're showing the month-to-month before and after the 0, but we also know that a point of time in a year, if there is a difference in terms of export and import, that would also explain there is a decline. So month by month and also year by year, if you have it. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very good question. So the first is, yes, COVID is the beast in any studies that are in this time period. So what we try to do is we try to, control for all sorts of product time fixed effects. And what we're essentially doing is comparing more fertilizer intensive to less fertilizer intensive products. So long as this COVID shock was not differential across fertilizer intensity, that's okay. But so basically we have to control for all sorts of product type fixed effects. And the second thing was about year by year. So so we control for seasonality. So that's one. And the other thing is, we can do year by year, but our date we are in 2023 now, so we will get 2 periods. So, but yes, it's very short. That's the problem. But we can definitely show it because for the pre-period we have a lot of data. And the third question was about the political. Yeah, so this is very interesting, right? Because the government is saying that this is a ban on chemical fertilizers because we want to make the country organic. But we have colleagues in the country office who actually spoke to people there and tried to understand what was going on. But nobody had any clue that this ban was coming. So the farmers had no training in organic fertilizer. There was no organic fertilizer, very little organic fertilizer in the country. So if you have to make this transition, it cannot be a one-day transition. It's a very complicated process. We also spoke to agricultural economists who were like, yeah, like all the agriculture is dependent on chemical fertilizer. If you need to move to organic, it just takes years. So this was obviously a policy which was not definitely taken in consultation with people who know agriculture. So we suspect that it had something to do with, the general idea that if you ban imports, you can save your money, your currency, because you're not paying for dollar, but then you also lose out on exports, which is sometimes another step forward of thinking and which is sometimes overlooked.
Just on that point, so are you suggesting that, and presumably the strain on reserves was emerging at that time, and therefore the desire to conserve foreign exchange reserves by reducing import was actually the major driver, and then the government wanted to score a point by saying, okay, this is all for sustainable.
That's what our understanding by talking to people, by reading news is. It's not something the government said, it's something what we think as researchers.
I think there was a question behind you first, right? So let me go to the gentleman over there, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghose. I'm Shishir Bandari. I'm currently studying at American University, International Economic Relations, and also working on debt issues. As the timeline of your research falls under that there was a sovereign debt crisis in Sri Lanka, and did you find any relations between the debt crisis and the import ban? Because there was 300 items banned, I think, made by the Sri Lankan government to curb the balance of payment crisis.
Yes.
And is there any possibility of recurrence of these kind of policies in the future? Because the economic forecast for Sri Lanka is pretty bad for coming years.
Yeah, so actually, I mean, I have a separate paper that looks at the overall ban. This is just on fertilizer ban, but as you said, there was a ban on like many products. So yes, I think as I was saying, the idea was that the country doesn't have money, and so by restricting import, it can save money. And so, but the reason this, I mean, to answer your question, that we haven't explicitly looked into this paper about the effect of the sovereign debt crisis or something, because this kind of was just before the crisis, and in fact, indirectly, it was inspired by it in the sense that, oh, we don't have money, so we're going to do this ban. Yeah, so I mean, for the sovereign. But you were asking whether this can recur in future. I have no idea, but one interesting thing I can say is that we actually, from the other paper that we were looking at on the relationship between imports and exports for the overall ban, we actually find very little effect of the ban on exports, because the government was trying to actually impose the ban on consumer goods, which are not presumably inputs into exports. So I'm not 100% sure whether the government was successful in that. It's something we're still researching, but it looks like the effect on overall exports was not that much. But when it comes to fertilizer, it was devastating because it is literally an input in production.
Okay, just 1 minute. Salim, did you have any questions?
Just a very small question. First, I think.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for your excellent presentation. I have only one question, but mostly it will be a suggestion for, since it is a work in progress. See, thing is that agricultural yield is fertilizer maybe the one important input, but there may be other factors that impact your yield. And in your map, you have shown that some area there are, I still see some green, dark green kind of a scenario. That means that yield is very high. So what was the factor that helped those areas to have higher yield as compared to other areas? So have you taken any factor like weather and other variables?
Yeah, that's literally the work in progress. So we have like a remote sensing specialist who are basically getting us like all the gridded data. So at the very plot level, we are getting rainfall, temperature, everything. So the next step is to predict using all the weather variables, the
Like-
yield as a residual.
Yeah, just to say.
Yeah, that's
note
good.
that
Yeah.
if you can say that if fertilizer contributes certain percentage of yield increment,
Right.
then it will.
That's
that will
exactly work
give you
in
more-
progress. So in the
more-
next
more, yeah.
version,
Yes.
we should have that.
Thank you.
We had a question at the back, but Salim, was there something urgent? Okay, so let's take your question and then the last from Salim.
Yeah, I'll just make it.
Yeah, thank you. So one question is about wondering about the domestic production of fertilizer, whether there's an existing factory and that can mitigate the shock, and also about there might be more investment in building more factories inside Sri Lanka to kind of deal with the shock, and that is maybe more, I don't know, welfare improving in the future because they are going to have a domestic industry and not relying so much on the import. But have you, maybe check.
So what we understood by talking with, we don't know exactly the percentage of domestic production of fertilizer in the country, but what we understood is that it's very, very minimal. There's barely any. So I mean, of course, I haven't investigated how this can affect the domestic fertilizer industry, but my suspicion is that such a short ban, which was rolled out in 6 months, also doesn't help a domestic fertilizer industry to grow. In fact, like now, World Bank and other institutions are giving fertilizers to Sri Lanka because they don't have any. So I don't think that's going to help the domestic industry, this kind of like shock therapy.
Just a very quick comment. We know that it's very difficult to explain why that decision was taken. It's very, very difficult decision. And but your argument about that, whether it was mainly because to save money or save foreign exchange, but I may not really agree with you because the time when the decision was taken, Sri Lanka was not in that crisis, and the crisis came a bit later. And then we saw a lot of import restrictions or bans when that crisis actually took place. And your data shows that even though the import of fertilizer was banned, but the import of rice shoot up like anything. So in any case, the foreign money was not saved because you are importing.
Right. So that's exactly the point. So like, I mean, again, as I said, it's something we understood by talking with many people. It's something which is not relevant for the paper, and I don't 100% know if that's the government's motive. That's because, but to say that this crisis was already brewing. So the whole sovereign debt crisis comes into picture at a particular point in time. But before that, the country was already running out of reserves. And that's when all these policies started coming into the picture of import ban. Just like for the broader import ban, we have some ideas that it was done to save currency. But but as you see, the rice imports went up specifically because there was no rice in the country. So it was basically the rice.
I suppose they are not really organic rice.
Sorry?
They are not organic.
No. At this point, it's just like we have no rice. So they're just like getting rice. There was zero rice imports, and then it's worth $40 million in January 2022. So agriculture contributes about 8% of GDP in Sri Lanka, and about a quarter of people are employed in agriculture. Rice is the main staple, and it's also one of the main things that Sri Lanka produces, but it doesn't export that much rice because it's like, and it didn't import rice to, as you can see, barely, but this is what all changed recently.
I just wanted to add.
Very well. We also are running out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Ghose. That was a fascinating study, and we look forward to the follow-up work that you're going to do, and hopefully there will be a presentation on that either in this forum or somewhere else.
Thank you.
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
It was very lively.
So I was saying that economic zones is a subject close to my heart, and one reason is that when Bangladesh started this massive economic zones program about 12 years ago, I was involved in the design. And our expectations were that among the many good results from economic zones would be increased productivity in firms and perhaps increased export orientation. But what does the evidence show? And that's what Dr. Mitali Pradhan, who is an assistant professor of economics at the Farmingdale State College, will tell us based on evidence from South Asia. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you to SANEM and World Bank for this opportunity to let me present my paper. So what I'm going to present before you today are the linkages that I find between being located in an industrial enclave and how well the firm performs using data from South Asia. So I'm very quickly just going to first define or explain what I mean by industrial enclaves. So what I call as industrial enclaves are known in South Asia and all around the world as special economic zones, industrial areas, industrial estates, industrial parks, free trade zones, EPZs, and a lot of other names. Depending on the kind of facilities, the privileges, the concessions that they get, there are nuanced differences. The data set that I'm using strictly focuses on industrial parks and EPZs. So very quickly, let's look at what we mean by an industrial park. So as the United Nations Industrial Development Organization defines it, an industrial park is essentially a developed plot of land, which is subdivided into plots with or without built-up factories and with common facilities, which are then allotted for a group of industries. EPZs mean something similar in terms of physical infrastructure. What's also special about EPZs that they are specifically created zones to promote exports. And hence they facilitate a very distinct regulatory regime in the form of tax incentives such as tariffs, quotas, duty concessions, which then differ from the rest of the economy. The objectives of industrial parks or EPZs or industrial enclaves in general are basically to promote economic growth and improve a location's competitiveness. Now, ideally, economic growth and improving competitiveness is a nationwide objective. It should be, and it is. But in a developing and a least developed country where we face several bottlenecks and capacity constraints, physical and soft infrastructure constraints, the idea then is, well, if we can make at least some targeted investments, be it public or private, in specific areas, then that can sort of jumpstart the production process and speed up the process of industrialization for that area. And then it's also expected to have a lot of positive spillover effects, such as that regional development can, or that zonal development can then lead to broader regional development. It can increase demand for other related, industrial related and retail services, banking, logistics, and so on. So these are the benefits that are supposed to or hoped that come out of these industrial enclaves. But then there have been some criticisms in the analytical literature as well. The most important is perhaps that they are met with very limited success. So in practice, very few studies that have analyzed these industrial enclaves of any kind that I've described in the previous slide show that, well, they may have been successful in East Asia, not so much in Sub-Saharan Africa. Then there's also a danger that there can be a lot of bureaucracy and red tape involved in allocation. And so there could be misallocation to favored firms and geographical regions. And the most important econometric challenge or criticism here is that measuring impact, what we call as causal impact itself, is challenging because there's very little data specifically available about firms that are located within these industrial enclaves. And so the research question that I'm asking is a very simple one. So I'm trying to estimate or ask, are these industrial enclaves or firms located within these industrial enclaves associated with better firm performance as compared to firms that are not located in an industrial enclave? And I measure performance using 4 firm outcomes. So I use sales, labor productivity, which is simply measured as sales per worker. I use export potential and export magnitude to do this analysis. This is a very quick preview of my findings. So what I find is a resounding yes, that yes, firms which are located within an industrial enclave that I call here as enclave firms have 19.8% higher sales as compared to non-enclave firms. They experience 12.3% greater labor productivity. Their probability of exporting is 4.2 percentage points higher. And for the firms that do export, the percentage of direct sales, export to sales is 3.4% higher for those firms which are located within an industrial enclave as compared to those that are not. I am, with the data set that I'm using and the methodology that I've used so far, I'm not able to come up with a plausible explanation, though, of what might explain these better outcomes. So the data that I'm using comes from the latest rounds of the World Bank Enterprise Surveys. Now, the World Bank Enterprise Surveys are a nationally representative data set for a whole number of countries that data is collected for. These survey instruments are, again, in the last recent very many years have been standardized so that these data sets essentially can be aggregated across time, country, and regions. And so that's exactly what I do. I use the latest rounds of the data for Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka and create a pooled cross-sectional data set. Now, this data set or the survey asks the firms a whole bunch of questions on firm characteristics such as trade, infrastructure, regulations, access to finance. Of course, there are characteristics such as firm size and private or public ownership and so on. And apart from all these firm characteristics, they're also asked a simple question. They're asked to indicate whether or not, it's a yes or a no question, whether or not they're located in an industrial park or an export processing zone. And that's why, going back to the what I said about industrial enclaves. So when I refer to industrial enclaves, I'm strictly going by the World Bank survey data and referring to industrial park or an EPZ. So this is the sample distribution that I arrive at by aggregating these data sets. I have 12,800 observations, rounding off, in my data, of which, so about 51% are not located in an industrial enclave. So they answer no to either being located in an industrial park or an export processing zone. And about 49% in total are located in one of the two. Of this 49 now, as you can see, the breakup is about 46% of them are located in an industrial park. The remaining 3% are located in an export processing zone. So then here again, I'll say that this is why I'm not distinguishing between whether they are located in one or the other. My variable of interest only determines whether or not they're located in at least one of the two or they're not located in either of them. So how do I conduct this analysis? I set up a very simple regression framework where my dependent variable of interest is each of those 4 outcome variables. So I regress log of sales, log of labor productivity. I create an export dummy that takes the value 1 if the direct exports of that firm are a positive number. And I then also use the actual percentage of direct exports as sales, which are reported in the survey, as another 4th outcome variable. So these each respectively is my dependent variable. I regress those on a whole bunch of firm characteristics such as firm age, number of workers, firm size, legal status, percentage of private ownership. And my main variable of interest is what I call the enclave firms. So now this is a binary variable, an indicator variable that takes the value 1 if the survey respondents have answered a yes to being either located in an industrial park or an export processing zone, and 0 otherwise. And apart from this, I also throw in country fixed effects, industry fixed effects, region fixed effects, and then an error term. Now, if I see, and as we see in the preview, that I do see differences in outcomes between firms that are located within an industrial enclave and firms that are not, then the next obvious question to ask is, well, what might be a very simple explanation of this within the constraints of the data set that I have? So the survey also asks these firms questions on a number of obstacles, and they are asked to rate each of these obstacles on a scale of 0 to 4. 0 means that that question is not an obstacle to business, and 4 means that it's a severe obstacle to business. So then so it's a Likert scale. I use the values of this scale for various obstacles that I'll show you in the results table, and I regress that on exactly the same specification on the right-hand side. And so I'll very quickly move to the results. And so here are the results, as you can see them. So we can find that after including those fixed effects, the firms that are located within an industrial enclave are associated with 19.8% higher sales as compared to firms that are not located in an industrial enclave. They also exhibit higher labor productivity, a 4.2% higher export potential or a probability of exporting, and the direct exports are 3.4% higher too. So then coming to what could explain this, or well, if they are doing better, then the explanation perhaps has to be because they have better access to land, because they have better access to electricity, better access to inputs, and so on. So what I've done is I've categorized these obstacles into what we call, and the World Bank also uses this terminology in its literature, as hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, and business environment. Backing up a slide here. So then we're not so much looking at the magnitude of these coefficients. What we're looking for, though, is the sign. And what we would then expect to see is a negative and a statistically significant coefficient, which would tell that, well, if the firms are located in an industrial enclave, each of these is less of an obstacle. And what's interesting about these results is I find that only for electricity and access to inputs. So what the evidence or what my analysis so far shows is that, well, these firms do say that access to electricity is less of an obstacle as compared to firms not located within an industrial enclave, and access to inputs is less of an obstacle as compared to firms not located in an industrial enclave. Again, each of the other coefficients are either not statistically significant or they don't have that negative sign at all. This in itself is important because when the firms are ranked in terms of what they find the biggest obstacles to be when they're doing this ranking, which is also a question in that data set, they do say that electricity is the second biggest obstacle after corruption for both enclave and non-enclave firms. I don't find a negative or a statistically significant coefficient here at all. And so then with the analysis that I've done so far, I can conclude that yes, data does show that firms located within an industrial enclave are systematically doing better in terms of sales, labor productivity, export potential, and export magnitude as compared to firms that are not located inside. However, if the explanation might be, or if then what should follow is, yes, it's because they have better access to those infrastructural facilities that the industrial enclaves are supposed to provide, then that is not what data shows either. So what I've come up and conclusion is here that this analysis just leads to more questions and begets more nuanced analysis. Probably a case study, a countrywide case study maybe, or a zonal case study where we are specifically looking at an industrial zone, because we do see what the policymakers would like to know, that yes, the firms are doing better, but then it would help to get a better understanding of, well, okay, if it's not this, then what is it? What is it that's working and that can be then replicated to other places and other zones? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if we stick to the 2 p.m. deadline, we have only 1 minute. So I'll ask Salim if we can, 5 more minutes. So one question at the back, and then I'll come to you. And then a third question to you. Please. Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much for this presentation, and it's very interesting to see your evidence actually reconfirm a lot of assumptions that we make. I'm curious to know whether you had a chance to look at the industrial park or economic zones characteristics. That is, whether it's privately managed or publicly managed or PPP managed, because we always, when you are saying that East Asia versus South Asia and Africa, I think ownership pattern is very different in these three regions, especially Africa and South Asia.
Right. So an excellent question, and I would love to get my hands on that data. Unfortunately, however, that's not a piece of information that's there in the World Bank enterprise surveys. The surveys do tell us whether the firms are privately managed or they're of public ownership, not the zone itself. There's no information there about zones except for these yes or no questions. So, but that, yeah, that would be an excellent follow-up analysis. Thank you.
Well, in South Asia, I think the prevalence of privately owned zones is not that much to start with. I mean, Bangladesh is now has gone for a few private economic zones, and I don't know what, I think in India there are probably some, but the numbers are not very large to start with.
Thank you. Great presentation. So one question that I had, so the story of selection, right? So there is a kind of apprehension that your results might be overestimated, because you see, the first question is that a firm who is deciding to locate in an enclave could be fundamentally different than a firm which is not. So if we had some pre-existing, so let's say ex ante rather than ex post characteristic, that would be good for controlling, number one. Number two is that I know for a reason that you have not controlled for firm fixed effect. You had industry, country. Because you are using panel, it would be interesting to see if you use firm fixed effect, whether the results hold or not. One thing you could do, because it's a panel, if there is a entry or exit information, so you know a firm was outside the enclave and they decided to enter the enclave. And if you use that as some kind of treatment, I think many of the selection questions that you might face would be resolved. Thank you.
Thank you. So what I'm using is not a panel. I'm just using the latest round of every survey. The catch again there is, it's not panel data in the sense it's not the same firms that the bank goes back again to survey. It is a nationally representative firm level data set, but the firms, well, they change. So there's no indicator variable as far as I can remember. In any case, it's not a panel that is, systematically collected every year. And so going back to what you started asking your question, you're 100% right. There's endogeneity here, which is why I'll preface this by saying, well, this is not a causal claim at all. All I'm showing is a simple correlation. And a simple correlational analysis shows that, firms do perform better. But then you're 100% right. They're self-selecting to be located in an industrial enclave. And that's the catch. So we need to come up with a causal inference here, but there we're short on data. I mean, what kind of a data set do you use to then explain or come up with some theory that makes a causal claim?
Okay, very quickly, we'll take a question there. And shall we take 3 questions together and then you answer? Okay, so one there, one here, and one here.
Thank you for your presentation. My first question is basically regarding the data. So you said you have taken the latest rounds. As far as I know, for Bangladesh, it was the latest was in 2013, I guess. So is there anything you got after that, basically?
No. So short answer, no.
Yeah, actually, I do not have a specific question, but a comment. But a comment, or you can take as a suggestion as well. One of your slides, you have shown very interesting result, is that there is a negative relationship with electricity input. That means that infrastructure does not have any barrier for trade. But what matters is basically the customs, taxes, and others. So to me, it is a bureaucracy that is actually creating the problem for the trade, even if they are on the farm enclave. So since you have multi-country data, can we just have that kind of a different for different countries, like whether can we see whether this bureaucracy matters in India most or in Bangladesh less or whatever, we don't know actually. So that's what my observation from your study. Thank you.
You want to respond? No, fascinating. I think this can be a very interesting project, and many papers I think can emerge from this. I just wanted to see one way in which you can do this is you look at the industry region that the firm is looking, because what are we comparing this firm to, right? Is it some firm in, let's say India, and some firm in Maharashtra that's in an EPZ versus another firm in Bihar that's not in an EPZ? I'm wondering if they're capturing some of the agglomeration effects that you see, of firms that locate in certain industry regions. So maybe if you could compare it to a regional study or look at an industry region effect on firms by using other data and then contrast it with the effects that you find from this data. And maybe that could be a sort of a better counterfactual is what I'm saying. So that could be sort of one way in which you can add more data and take it forward for each country. And I had just one more question. Do you have any information on foreign ownership?
Yes, so that feeds into the question of are they publicly owned or it's a private ownership. Right. I think foreign ownership is also a question. Yeah, so they're all 90, something like more than 90% of them are privately owned, but they're also domestic ownership, not foreign, at least for South Asia. At least
most of them are domestic. Yeah. So that's how you can contrast the story with Vietnam, with they're mainly, exporting firms and foreign owned. And also I found it interesting that you found that these firms find that telecom is a bigger barrier, right? Than those that are not in EPZs?
Yeah, beats me.
So, okay.
Totally beats me. And I mean, I'm using a basic regression framework. So it's again a correlational analysis. We are not even interpreting the magnitude of the coefficient.
Right.
But there should be a negative sign, right? But it's not negative. It's positive and statistically significant. Right. So they are saying each of these is more of a barrier than the firms that are located outside.
Which I found surprising.
Yeah.
But thank you, fascinating study.
Thank you.
Okay, just one small point. EPZ firms are by definition export-oriented, and they could be 100% export, but the number of EPZ firms are small, so I don't think that's a distortion. But I was also wondering about the agglomeration effects, the fact that the enterprises are together, whether they're learning something from each other, and that if you have not explored that, maybe that's something to explore in the future, because you still would like to explain the results, right? Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Pradhan. That was fascinating. In fact, we had 4 very fascinating presentations, and I'll just end by saying that between the 4 presentations, I think we have touched upon some of the big challenges or questions in development. The challenge of sustainable development was captured, I think, in the first 2 or no, the first and the third presentations. The challenge of increasing trade orientation. We had a very interesting presentation on shipping costs and its impact on trade. And of course, the question of productivity of firms and export orientation. So a lot of the very important development challenges were covered in today's session. So let's give a hand to all the presenters for the excellent presentation. And I think on to lunch now, right?
We'd like to have a group photo. Is it possible, Joe?